And I'm wondering, you have a question you want to ask, and I think you should ask it, Leslie.
Well, it was just actually a pushback to my own self. For a long time in my history classes, I would tell the students, we can only talk about the present in the last 10 minutes of the class. And I don't do that anymore. But the reason I did that is sometimes I would see people wanting to use the past to prop up their own present day convictions, which often led them not to listen to the people in the past. So they would look back and say, I want to find someone in the past who agrees with what I think. And they would be endlessly upset. W.B. Du Bois did not think about race in the same ways that we think about race and racism today. We should listen to W.B. Du Bois. You can't go back and find your person in the past who thinks exactly like you do. And so I saw it as a way to kind of avoid reckoning with the complexities and the uncomfortability of the past. And so I'm actually realizing that sometimes I ask my students not to talk about the present. But again, I don't do that anymore. I ask them to make the connections more specific. But I wonder if people have any comments on presentism.
Yeah.
As Kimberly brought up.
Yeah, this is a great, yeah. So presentism, that's sort of, as you've already explained so well, sort of the concern that people are using the present to sort of make sense of the past and choose the things from the past that they want to focus on. Does anybody have any thoughts about how you try to avoid presentism? I know one of the tactics that I used in the classroom was you would have students saying, we did this. I taught U.S. history, teach U.S. history, and students would often say, they would start by saying, we did this. And I would say, okay, I understand where you're coming from, but you weren't there. We were talking about the Civil War. You were definitely not there. And so why don't you say they, and try to put that out there a little bit. And I think that worked in some cases, but I think also it didn't allow for them to make the kinds of connections. So maybe some of you can talk a little bit more about this danger, how you tried to navigate it, and then maybe we could just sort of spin this into the larger last question for the panel before we get out in the audience, which are, what are the strategies that you use to balance your work and your responsibilities and your obligations as a historian and as a scholar, and your being a citizen and a person that wants to be an activist? How do you balance those two things?
A while back, someone asked the question, and I've been thinking about an answer to the question ever since, and I think it goes to this question as well. And the question asked was, what are some examples, good models of historians that have performed the function of telling us about ourselves in such a way as to make us better? Now, earlier, Van Woodward was mentioned, and I think that's a really good example. But the folks that came to my mind are, first of all, Charles Beard, who explained to us how the fascinating interplay of self-interest and the public interest in the creation of the American Republic. And especially the role that Alexander Hamilton's funding of the debt played in creating the country. Gave us a fundamental understanding of how our country came to be and how it worked at the beginning. Frederick Turner, who described the important role to us of our frontier and how the frontier fundamentally shaped the United States, both economically and socially. Parrington, who added to that, Vernon Parrington, who added to that basic notion an idea of how we were given this magnificent heritage. And one of the great problems of the 19th and the 20th century is finding a way to conserve and preserve that physical heritage. Conservation as the fundamental movement of American history. And a fourth, Arthur Schlesinger, who reminded us of the great importance both of the middle, that is the vital center in American politics, and the need to return always to that vital center and shared set of liberal values that fundamentally that we all have in common. And at the same time, the natural tendency of history over time, the historical pattern in a democracy to go from, with a fairly narrow boundaries from left to right and back again. Those are some examples of how American historians have played a brilliant role as pundits explaining us to ourselves.
And I'm going to push back on Fred a little bit. Bob's not surprised. And say that a subsequent generation of historians push back on exactly the figures who you're talking about. So to take someone like Frederick Jackson Turner, and for generations of Americans, Frederick Jackson Turner defined America in terms of the glory of the democracy that was started on the frontier. But from our point of view today, he had a lot of blind spots about Native Americans, about women, about the entire southwest portion of the country, which became part of the American frontier, but of course was originally not part of the United States. And so historians from a later generation, like Hattie Nelson Limerick and other people like that, have really pushed back on some of those models and then revised our thinking in ways that are more inclusive and not thinking of American history primarily as the story of the achievements of white men, but bringing in other characters into the history. And I think this somewhat goes back to the question that Leslie was posing about how do we go about changing narratives, right? And who are some historians who have changed those narratives and led us to rethink. When C. Van Wibber was writing, he was pushing back against a group of historians who had written from a very white perspective about slavery and its aftermath, and who had talked about slavery being, well, it was a pity that they brought the slaves over from Africa, but seeing as they'd done that, this paternalistic institution did the best it could in training these poor Africans who had landed on our shores. And historians like C. Van Wibber pushed back about that and really redefined the narrative. So I think that the figures that you're talking about are important figures in American history who are still studied, but many of the narratives, and I focus particularly on Frederick Jackson Turner as a Western historian, that narrative has been reinterpreted again and again since then to encompass some of our current values in terms of diversity that were left out before.
We're going to need to close up so we can give these folks a chance to ask some questions. So maybe some 1-2 minutes of closing comments from.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I start?
Yeah, go for it, David.
Okay. So I thank you for that. I mean, I think that you mean American history basically hasn't told the Native perspective, hasn't told the minority perspective, a lot of times the women's perspective on history. And most of history, from my perspective, has written not from those perspectives at all, where historians ignored and made invisible other voices in history. And so my blog is all about that, pretty much, and suggesting that there's huge, vast territories in history that are not written yet, mainly because the whole discipline was dominated by white males, and that's a big problem. I was going to talk about the presentism for a second. I mean, I get that all the time, I get presentations all the time, and people come up to me afterwards, after I've talked about genocide and everything else, and they say, well, I'm sorry that we did that to you. I'm like, you didn't do it to me, and you don't have to be sorry about that, just understand that, and pass on this history to the next people so they don't do it ever again.
Sure, I just actually kind of continuing along that same line. One example in terms of people historians engaged in the public sphere. And also a good teaching text is Silencing the Past by Michelle Rolfe-Trio, about which sort of a quick synopsis is about how silences enter the historical record. And I think it's incredibly useful as a historian, but also for students to think about the moments at which silences enter. So in the moment of fact creation, what sources get made and left. In the moment of archive creation, so how do these sources end up in an archive or not? Are they even accessible? In the moment of narrative creation, so as we're retrieving these facts and writing a narrative of the history, and then in the last moment of sort of making history or the retrospective significance of these things. So, I mean, I think we're always based in a specific moment when we're writing history, and so in a certain sense, presentism is always part of what we do, but then to be aware of it and to teach our students to be aware of their own sort of their own role and how that is different from the past, and the silences that we try to address as each sort of new generation of historians is important.
I have a confession to make. I'm a European historian. And what I would like to say, not that I'm disagreeing with anybody here, but we need a wider perspective. We need to know what happened in other countries, in other civilizations. And I think for us to be too focused on just American history is a huge, huge mistake. And given the world we live in now, the Trump to the contrary, globalization is a reality. Okay, you know, let's not pretend it isn't. So I think that the need for history and for observations and commentary and so on needs to be much broader than our own American history.
All right, we have some time for audience questions, so I'm happy to